Today we're diving into one of the most famous openings in chess, the Queen's Gambit. I'll show you the top 3 deadly traps hidden inside this opening that can catch your opponent off guard and win games fast. Let's jump right in. We start with the pawn to d4, black responds with pawn to d5, and then white plays pawn to c4, offering the Queen's Gambit pawn. Now, the very first mistake that many players make, one that is extremely common, is for black to accept the gambit and give up control of the center. So what exactly is wrong with black capturing this pawn? There's a very common misunderstanding here, and let me explain it clearly. In chess, the general strategy is to develop your pieces, castle your king safely, and occupy the center of the board. That means controlling the 4 central squares. By offering this pawn on c4, white is trying to lure black away from the center. When black accepts the gambit, white's mission is accomplished successfully. What black usually fails to recognize is that taking this pawn is not actually a free advantage. They often think, what's wrong with capturing a free pawn? And even if white eventually wins it back, that's just an even trade. But the problem is deeper. By accepting the pawn, white gets full control of the center and achieves a stronger position. On top of that, white can easily regain the pawn later by simply playing pawn to e3. After white plays pawn to e3, the pawn on c4 can be won back immediately on the next move. For example, if black simply develops a piece, white can recapture the pawn and restore material balance. Let's play out a few more moves to see how white achieves their goal. Black develops, white develops in turn, and already the difference is clear. White has a strong pawn in the center that controls key squares and can advance forward to create threats, while black has nothing in the middle of the board. If we look carefully at the 4 central squares, we notice that black has no real influence there, while white completely dominates. This is why black should not give up control of the center so easily. Now, let me share a tactical idea that often comes up. Quite frequently, your opponent will bring the bishop to g4, pinning the white knight on f3. Some players are tempted here to turn this into a dramatic real gambit by sacrificing the queen, thinking, go ahead and take my queen, I'll deliver checkmate with bishop captures pawn on f7. It looks flashy, but in this particular case, it does not work. Instead of greedily capturing the queen, black should first capture the knight and only then take the queen, leaving white with no compensation. So, how should white handle this position instead of the failed queen sacrifice? If your opponent moves to one side, you go to the other and take advantage of the weaknesses they leave behind. Since the black bishop has moved away from the queen side, white can now place the queen on an active square, pressuring the weak pawn on f7, the pawn on b7, and at the same time targeting the knight on c6. At this point, black is already defenseless. They are going to lose at least one of their pawns. And if black tries to continue their own attack with bishop captures knight on f3, white should not recapture the bishop. Instead, there is something much stronger. White captures the pawn on f7, giving check to the black king. The king is forced to move, and then white brings the queen to a6, a quick and unexpected checkmate. In the previous example, black was punished by a tactical blunder at the end, and it may not be completely clear whether accepting the gambit pawn was truly the root cause of their downfall. Of course, taking the pawn on c4 does not lose the game immediately. It is just a step in the wrong direction. So let me now show you how the game can unfold if both sides continue with natural developing moves. Let's say both players develop normally. Black plays safe moves, white develops as well, and soon white's pieces are harmoniously placed. Now black faces a common problem: how to develop the bishop, which is blocked by the pawn on e6. Suppose black decides to fianchetto the bishop instead. At this exact moment comes the turning. Now let's say black develops the light-squared bishop to b7, which puts pressure on the white knight and also attacks the pawn on e4 twice. White must therefore develop carefully and defend the pawn. After that, black continues with normal development. In this position, white has a very strong idea, placing the rook on d1 directly opposite the black queen. Already, this creates a slightly uncomfortable situation for black. What can they really do here? If black tries to open the center with pawn to c5, the opposition between the rook and queen becomes a serious problem. If black instead moves the queen away, white can develop the bishop to g5, pinning the knight and threatening to push the pawn to a5. If black attempts to defend the bishop, white can simply bring the other rook into play. Very quickly, we reach a position where white dominates the board. The rooks are active on open files, the bishops are controlling powerful diagonals, and the central pawns are ready to advance at any moment. Meanwhile, black's position is cramped. Their pieces are stuck on the last 2 ranks with very little mobility. For example, the black knight has almost no squares to move to. All of its forward options are taken, so it can only retreat backward, which is not an ideal move. This highlights the core theme of the Queen's Gambit. White gains space, activity, and central control, while black often struggles for counterplay. In any case, the story is the same. The black bishop has very little room to move and cannot really do anything useful, while the black knight has no active squares at all. It can only shuffle toward the edge of the board, which is meaningless. This clearly shows why controlling the center is such a huge advantage for white, and why black should not give it up so easily. Now, let's move on. The second common misconception about the Queen's Gambit is that it is not really a gambit at all. The name is a little misleading. The truth is, if black accepts the pawn, they cannot realistically hold on to it. As we have already seen, white can simply play pawn to e3 and recover the pawn immediately on the very next move. There is simply no way for black to defend the pawn long term. For example, if black tries bishop to e6, it is very awkward because it blocks the pawn on a7, restricts the bishop itself, and also limits the black queen. White can then play knight to a3, adding a second attacker to the pawn on c4, and suddenly black is running out of options to defend it. If instead of bishop to e6, black attempts to protect the pawn by advancing pawn to b5, the problems continue. There is a classical Queen's Gambit trap that begins with white pushing the pawn to a4, aiming to break apart black's pawn chain. If black captures, white easily regains the material, activates their pieces, and obtains a lasting positional advantage. Even if black tries to hold the pawn structure, the plan often backfires. For example, if black plays pawn to a6 to guard the pawn temporarily, after the exchange of pawns, they overlook a critical detail. The rook on a8 is left undefended. White can simply capture it outright, winning the game on the spot. If instead black attempts to reinforce the pawn on b5 with pawn to c6, white exchanges pawns and then plays the sneaky move queen to f3, targeting an unusual but deadly idea, capturing the rook in the corner. Black is forced to surrender material to avoid immediate loss. No matter what they choose, they will have to give up either the rook, the knight, or the bishop. In every case, white emerges with a decisive material advantage and a winning position. In the next example, black starts correctly by playing pawn to a6, supporting their center. Both sides then develop their knights, but soon black repeats the same fundamental mistake we discussed earlier, giving up control of the center. White continues with pawn to e3, preparing to recover the gambit pawn, and here black commits another common error by developing the knight to c6. This move is especially interesting to discuss, because for many beginners it is confusing. Why would knight to c6 be a mistake? In most openings, this is considered a natural and even ideal developing move. But in the Queen's Gambit, the story is different, so why exactly is knight to c6 a mistake in this position? Let's play out a few more moves to understand it. Suppose both sides continue developing naturally, and then white pushes pawn to e4, fully occupying the center. Now what options does black have? They would like to develop the dark squared bishop, but it is not easy. If the bishop goes to d7, it remains very passive. If black tries pawn to b6, followed by bishop to b7, the bishop ends up blocked by the knight on c6. In all of these variations, there is another problem. Black would love to strike at the center with pawn to c5, putting pressure on white's pawns. But the knight on c6 is sitting in the way, making it difficult for black to free their queenside pieces. This single knight blocks the pawn break, prevents the bishop from becoming active, and delays the rook and queen from entering the game. In short, the knight actually hampers black's entire position. So what should black have done instead? The correct move order is to first play pawn to c5, challenging the center right away. Only after that should the knight come to c6. With this setup, black is immediately attacking the pawn on d4 3 times, creating strong counterplay. Of course, white can defend the pawn successfully for the moment, but notice how the situation changes. White is now tied down to the constant defense of the pawn on d4. They cannot easily push it forward because that would simply lose material. They also cannot move the queen away freely because the pawn would fall. And if white ever exchanges pawns on c5, then black equalizes instantly, the center is gone, and the position becomes symmetrical and balanced. Therefore, by starting with pawn to c5 before developing the knight, black achieves a much more favorable position. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.